11.87%. Sit with that number for a moment. According to the latest StatCounter data from July 2026, Linux accounted for 11.87% of measured desktop operating system usage in the United States. Across North America more broadly, the figure came in at 10.65%, which means the headline that the technology world has been waiting decades to write has apparently arrived. 1 in roughly every 10 measured US desktop visits is coming from a Linux machine. Except here's the problem. If that number is accurate, something genuinely extraordinary happened. Linux's desktop share in the United States does not move in dramatic leaps. It inches. It creeps. It grows in ways that are mostly visible only when you zoom out over years. A jump to nearly 12% would represent one of the most significant shifts in desktop computing since smartphones stopped being the future and became the present. So, before we declare Linux's long-awaited mainstream moment, we need to ask the more important question. What exactly happened here, and how much of it is real? To understand why this number is so jarring, you need to understand what Linux's desktop story has looked like for the past 20 years. Windows built something close to a monopoly on the consumer desktop. Not a legal monopoly in every jurisdiction, but a practical one. The software was pre-installed on nearly every PC sold through mainstream retail. The applications people used were built for Windows. The games were built for Windows. The corporate IT infrastructure was built for Windows. Choosing something different was a deliberate act that required research, technical tolerance, and willingness to give up certain conveniences. macOS carved out a premium segment. Apple controlled its own hardware ecosystem, built a polished user experience, and attracted creative professionals, students, and eventually a broader consumer audience. macOS never had Windows-level market share, but it had a stable, identifiable presence. Linux lived somewhere else entirely. It ran on the servers that powered the internet. It ran in data centers, research institutions, and development environments. On the desktop, it was the operating system of enthusiasts, developers, privacy advocates, and people who genuinely enjoyed configuring things. Its desktop share in major Western markets spent years in the low single digits. That context is what makes 11.87% feel like a category change. Not just a percentage moving, a label changing, from alternative to mainstream. So what happened? And more importantly, is the number telling the truth? Start with the measurement itself, because this is where the story immediately becomes more complicated. StatCounter does not conduct a census of desktop computers. It does not send researchers to count the operating systems running on machines across America. What StatCounter does is measure web traffic through a network of websites that use its analytics tools. When visitors arrive at those sites, StatCounter records information about their browsers, devices, and operating systems. The percentage of traffic associated with each operating system becomes that system's reported share. This is useful data, but it is not the same as asking how many desktop computers in America are actually running Linux right now. Web traffic share is influenced by who visits the tracked sites and how often. It is influenced by which websites are in StatCounter's network. It is influenced by how traffic gets classified. And critically, it is influenced by automated traffic. Bots, scrapers, crawlers, and other non-human visitors that still generate operating system signatures. PC World specifically investigated the July 2026 Linux figures and raised questions about whether changes in StatCounter's measurement approach and the presence of Linux-associated automated traffic may have contributed to the spike. That is not a dismissal of the number. It is a reason for precision. The difference between Linux reached 11.87% usage share in one traffic measurement system and 1 in 10 American desktops now runs Linux is significant, and treating them as identical would be a mistake. So we have a question. Did Americans actually switch to Linux in unprecedented numbers, or did the measuring tape change? The answer, it turns out, is more interesting than either option alone. Here's what makes the July 2026 figure genuinely strange, independent of the bot traffic question. The US figure came in at 11.87%, North America at 10.65%. But worldwide, StatCounter's July 2026 data puts Linux at approximately 7.53% of desktop usage globally. Think about that gap for a moment. The United States is not typically the market where Linux adoption leads the world. Europe has historically shown stronger Linux adoption in certain countries, particularly Germany, Finland, and other markets with strong open source communities or privacy-focused regulatory cultures. Some developing markets show high Linux figures, so why would the United States, in July 2026, report a Linux desktop share that is dramatically higher than the global figure? That regional gap does not automatically prove the number is wrong, but it demands an explanation. Either something specifically and powerfully happened in American Linux adoption that did not happen at the same scale elsewhere, or something specific to how American web traffic was being measured and classified contributed to the figure. The honest answer is probably some combination. And that combination is where the real story lives. because here is what gets buried if you stop the investigation at it might be bots. Linux desktop adoption in the United States was already moving upward before the July 2026 spike arrived. The US had crossed the 5% threshold in 2025, according to StatCounter related tracking. The trajectory was real before the controversy started. Which means even if the 11.87% figure overstates human desktop Linux usage, and there are legitimate reasons to think it might, the underlying direction of travel is not a fiction. Linux was growing. The disputed number may have distorted the magnitude. It did not invent the trend. And that is the first major turning point in this story. Because now the interesting question is no longer simply, is 11.87% accurate? It becomes, if Linux has been genuinely growing, what is actually causing it? The answer is not a single event. It is a collision of several separate forces that happen to be pushing in the same direction at the same time. Start with Windows. Because the most consequential thing that happened for Linux desktop adoption in the last 2 years may not have been anything Linux did at all. It may have been what Microsoft required. Windows 11 introduced hardware requirements that excluded a significant number of older machines. Trusted platform module support, specific CPU generations, minimum RAM thresholds. These requirements were technically defensible, but practically disruptive for users running older hardware that worked perfectly well under Windows 10. Then came the end of support deadline for Windows 10. Microsoft announced that security updates for Windows 10 would end in October 2025. That left users with functional older computers facing a decision that had no obviously comfortable answer. They could buy a new PC. For users on tight budgets with machines that still ran well, that option carried real financial cost. They could stay on Windows 10 past the end of support date. That meant running an operating system no longer receiving security patches, which carries its own risks. Or they could install something else. Linux benefits directly from being the most accessible, free, and increasingly capable something else available. The Windows transition did not convert millions of users to Linux automatically, but it enlarged the population of users who had concrete, practical reasons to consider alternatives. That enlargement matters. The other historical obstacle Linux faced was its own reputation, and that reputation was not entirely unfair. Installing Linux a decade ago meant navigating decisions that required meaningful technical comfort. Choosing a distribution, partitioning a drive, dealing with driver issues for wireless cards, audio systems, and graphics hardware. Discovering that a critical application did not have a Linux version. Learning package management from a terminal prompt. Accepting that certain things simply would not work without research and patience. That barrier was real. It filtered Linux's desktop users toward a specific profile. Technically confident, curious, and tolerant of friction. Modern Linux distributions have not eliminated all of that complexity, but they have pushed it far enough toward the edges that ordinary users can install and use Linux without encountering most of it. Distributions like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and Fedora offer installation experiences that compare reasonably well with what most users experience when setting up Windows on a new machine. Graphical software centers make installing applications recognizable. System settings are navigable without terminal commands. Hardware detection has improved dramatically for common consumer devices. Automatic updates work quietly in the background. The desktop environments, particularly KDE Plasma and GNOME in their current forms, do not require users to understand what a desktop environment is. The barrier has not vanished, but it is lowered enough that the pool of people capable of making Linux their primary operating system without significant pain has grown substantially. And then there is gaming, because gaming changed the Linux conversation in ways that nothing else had managed. Valve, the company behind the Steam gaming platform, invested seriously in Linux compatibility through a translation layer called Proton. Proton allows a substantial fraction of Windows games to run on Linux without native Linux versions. The compatibility list grew, and the quality of compatibility improved. The Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming device, runs a Linux-based operating system by default. It sold in meaningful numbers to people who were purchasing it as a gaming device, not as a Linux adoption decision. But the side effect was that millions of people began interacting with Linux hardware without ever consciously choosing to run Linux. Steam's own hardware survey data from March 2026 showed Linux at approximately 5.33% of the Steam user base. Now, that figure needs careful handling. Steam users are heavily weighted toward PC gamers. The Steam Deck inflates Linux figures within that dataset specifically because every Steam Deck counts as a Linux device. The Steam percentage does not translate directly to general desktop Linux adoption. But the direction matters. Gaming was Linux's most stubborn weakness for years. The question was never whether Linux could run productivity software or development tools. The question was always whether it could run the games people actually wanted to play. That question now has a more encouraging answer than it did 5 years ago. Not a perfect answer, but an increasingly credible one. There is another Linux growth story that happens in plain sight, but rarely gets connected to desktop adoption statistics. It lives in the professional world. Linux already runs most of the internet's infrastructure: cloud servers, containerized applications, Kubernetes clusters, AI training environments. Linux is the default operating system in virtually every professional computing context outside the Windows-dominated corporate desktop. Developers building modern software spend their working lives inside Linux environments, even when their laptop is technically running Mac OS or Windows with a compatibility layer. That professional familiarity creates a different kind of pathway to the desktop. A software engineer who has spent years working within Linux tooling, managing Linux servers, and building applications for Linux environments does not experience Linux the way an unfamiliar user does. The conceptual overhead is already gone. The question is not, can I figure this out, but is there a reason not to? This does not convert all developers into desktop Linux users. Many remain on Mac OS or Windows for legitimate reasons, including software compatibility and hardware preferences. But it means the population most likely to choose Linux voluntarily. People for whom the technical barrier is lowest has been growing alongside the broader expansion of software development and cloud infrastructure work. Now consider what the 10% threshold actually means, independent of whether the exact figure is precisely accurate. At 1%, Linux on the desktop is a curiosity, a number small enough that hardware manufacturers, software vendors, and game studios can confidently deprioritize it without significant commercial consequence. At 3%, Linux becomes visible. Enthusiast publications cover it. Developer communities take it seriously. At 5%, the conversation starts. Some companies begin testing Linux compatibility. Some game developers start asking whether a Linux port is worth the investment. At 10%, the arithmetic changes. 10% of a large market is not a rounding error. For a developer deciding whether to support an additional platform, for a hardware company deciding whether to certify a product, for a commercial software vendor evaluating whether to build a Linux version, 10% is a figure that requires a response rather than dismissal. This is why the psychological significance of the 10% number exceeds its mathematical precision. Even if the real figure is 7% or 8%, the conversation has changed. Linux is no longer being discussed in terms of whether it might someday become relevant to mainstream computing. The conversation is now about how relevant it already is. Market share can create its own momentum. More users generate more bug reports, more hardware testing, more community documentation, and more commercial attention. Whether Linux is currently at 8 or 12% matters less than whether it is establishing itself in a range where that feedback loop can strengthen. But the Linux celebration deserves a challenge here, because the global picture does not match the American headline. Worldwide, StatCounter's July 2026 data shows Linux at approximately 7.53% of desktop usage. That is a meaningful figure, but it is substantially below the US number, and different measurement systems produce different results entirely. Cloudflare's traffic data produces its own operating system distribution. Government website analytics produce another. Browser vendor statistics produce another still. Each dataset is observing a different slice of web behavior and answering a subtly different question. This creates a principle worth stating clearly. There is no single, universally agreed measurement of Linux desktop market share. There is a collection of traffic-based estimates, each of which reflects the behavior of the population that visits the sites or services being measured. StatCounter's 11.87% US figure represents Linux's share of desktop operating system traffic, measured through StatCounter's network of US accessed websites in July 2026. That is a specific and bounded claim. It does not represent a physical count of American desktop computers. It does not represent what every American website would show. And it should be read alongside the PC world, reporting that raised specific questions about whether automated traffic contributed to the result. Holding all of that simultaneously is the intellectually honest position. The number is real in the sense that it is what the measurement produced. It requires context in the sense that the measurement has limitations that affect how literally it should be interpreted. So what does the data actually prove with appropriate precision? The July 2026 StatCounter figure proves that Linux accounted for 11.87% of measured US desktop operating system traffic in that specific dataset during that specific month. It does not prove that 11.87% of all American desktop computers physically run Linux. It does not prove that 1 in 10 Americans uses Linux as their primary operating system. It does not prove the figure is fabricated. It does not erase the longer trend of Linux growth that predates the July spike. And it does not prove that Linux has displaced Windows or Mac OS as a mainstream consumer platform. The honest interpretation lives somewhere between the two extreme readings. The figure is almost certainly exaggerating human Linux desktop adoption to some degree, possibly substantially, based on current reporting about measurement methodology and automated traffic. The underlying Linux growth trend is also almost certainly real, based on the previous trajectory and the multiple independent factors driving adoption. The Windows angle deserves one more pass, because Linux does not need to defeat Windows everywhere to become strategically significant. It only needs to become a credible option for users who are already dissatisfied. Windows has advantages that are not going to disappear. Enormous software compatibility accumulated over decades, corporate IT infrastructure built around Windows Active Directory and management tools, OEM distribution that puts Windows on virtually every retail PC, game libraries that, despite Proton's progress, still assume Windows, inertia across hundreds of millions of users who have no reason to change. Linux has different advantages. It runs on hardware that Windows 11 refuses to support. It can be configured more precisely. It does not require purchasing a license. It gives users more control over update timing, privacy settings, and system behavior. It has a development and server ecosystem that is second to none. And it continues to improve its consumer-facing experience with each major distribution release. These ecosystems are not competing symmetrically. Linux is not trying to take every Windows user. It is becoming a viable destination for the users that Windows itself is pushing toward the exit, and for users whose specific needs Linux can now address without the friction that once made it impractical. Here is where everything in this story converges. The Linux desktop narrative in 2026 is no longer about potential. It stopped being purely about potential some time ago. The Steam Deck introduced Linux to a gaming audience that was not looking for it. Windows 10's end of support created decision pressure for millions of older PC users. Modern Linux distributions removed enough friction that the technical barrier affects a smaller fraction of potential users than it once did. Developer familiarity with Linux infrastructure created a pipeline of users who are already comfortable with the system. Gaming compatibility improved enough to stop being an automatic disqualifier. These are separate forces. They are not a single coordinated migration wave, but they are all moving in the same direction, and they are all doing so at the same time. Which means, even if the 11.87% figure turns out to overstate actual human Linux desktop adoption, and the evidence suggests some caution is warranted, the forces producing genuine Linux growth have not gone away. They are structural, and structural forces are more durable than a single month's measurement. Return to the number that started all of this, 11.87%. Maybe StatCounter refines its methodology and next month's figure is lower. Maybe independent analysis concludes that automated traffic inflated the July figure meaningfully. Maybe the true percentage of American desktop computers running Linux today is 6%, or 7%, or 8%. Even in those scenarios, something important has already happened. A decade ago, a claim that Linux might approach 10% desktop share in the United States would have been treated as the kind of optimistic projection that the Linux community was known for making and never fulfilling. The joke practically wrote itself. Linux was always 5 years away from the mainstream desktop. Linux was always almost ready. Linux was always the operating system that was going to matter soon. The conversation in 2026 is different. The question being debated is not whether Linux will ever get close to 10%. The question is how much of the 10% it apparently already has is genuine. That is a different argument. And it is evidence of how much the underlying reality has changed regardless of what the final precise percentage turns out to be. 11.87%. Read it again, but read it correctly this time. Not as a census, not as a physical count of every American desktop, not as proof that Linux has overtaken Windows or that the operating system wars are over. Read it as a measurement with real limitations, produced by a real trend, pointing at a real shift that has been building across gaming, development, hardware transitions, and distribution improvements for years. The most important question about the Linux desktop is no longer whether it will ever matter. It already matters. The hardware manufacturers who need to test drivers know it. The game studios evaluating Proton compatibility know it. The corporate IT departments managing mixed environments know it. The real question now is how much larger Linux can grow before the companies still treating it as an edge case have to treat it as a baseline. Because the most significant thing about the 10% story is not the number itself. It is the fact that we are finally arguing about whether Linux really crossed 10%, rather than arguing about whether Linux would ever get close. That argument took decades to become possible, and now that it has started, it is not going back.